Chapter 12 of the Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost Seers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost Seers, by Catherine Crow. Chapter 12 Troubled Spirits. A very curious circumstance, illustrative of the power of will, was lately narrated to me by a Greek gentleman, to whose uncle it occurred. His uncle, Mr. M., was some years ago travelling in Magnesia with a friend, when they arrived one evening at a caravanserai, where they found themselves unprovided with anything to eat. It was therefore agreed that one should go forth and endeavour to procure food, and the friend offering to undertake the office, Mr. M. stretched himself on the floor to repose. Some time had elapsed, and his friend had not yet returned, when his attention was attracted by a whispering in the room. He looked up, but saw nobody, though still the whispering continued, seeming to go round by the wall. At length it approached him, but though he felt a burning sensation on his cheek, and heard the whispering distinctly, he could not catch the words. Presently he heard the footsteps of his friend, and thought he was returning, but though they appeared to come quite close to him, and it was perfectly light, he still saw nobody. Then he felt a strange sensation, an irresistible impulse to rise. He felt himself drawn up, across the room, out of the door, down the stairs. He must go, he could not help it, to the gate of the caravanserai. A little farther, and there he found the dead body of his friend, who had been suddenly assailed and cut down by robbers, unhappily too plenty in the neighbourhood at that period. We here see the desire of the spirit to communicate his fate to the survivor, the imperfection of the rapport, or the receptivity, which prevented a more direct intercourse, and the exertion of a magnetic influence which Mr. M. could not resist, precisely similar to that of a living magnetizer over his patient. There is a story extant in various English collections, the circumstances of which are said to have occurred about the middle of the last century, and which I shall here mention on account of its similarity to the one that follows it. Dr. Bretton, who was late in life appointed rector of Ludgate, lived previously in Hertfordshire, where he married the daughter of Dr. Santer, a woman of great piety and virtue. This lady died, and one day, as a former servant of hers, to whom she had been attached, and who had since married, was nursing her child in her own cottage, the door opened, and the lady entered, so exactly resembling the late Mrs. Bretton in dress and appearance, that she exclaimed, "If my mistress were not dead, I should think you were she." Whereupon the apparition told her that she was, and requested her to go with her, as she had business of importance to communicate. Alice objected, being very much frightened, and entreated her to address herself rather to Dr. Bretton, but Mrs. B. answered that she had endeavoured to do so, and had been several times in his room for that purpose, but he was still asleep, and she had no power to do more toward awakening him than once uncover his feet. Alice then pleaded that she had nobody to live with her child, but Mrs. B. promising that the child should sleep to her return, she at length obeyed the summons, and having accompanied the apparition into a large field, the latter bade her observe how much she measured off with her feet, and having taken a considerable compass, she bade her go and tell her brother that all that portion had been wrongfully taken from the poor by their father, and that he must restore it to them, adding that she was the more concerned about it since her name had been used in the transaction. Alice then asked how she should satisfy the gentleman of the truth of her mission. Mrs. B. mentioned to her some circumstance known only to herself and this brother. She then entered into much discourse with the woman, and gave her a great deal of good advice. Remaining till, hearing the sound of horse bells, she said, "Alice, I must be seen by none but yourself," and then disappeared. Whereupon Alice proceeded to Dr. Bretton, who admitted that he had actually heard some one walking about his room, in a way he could not account for. On mentioning the thing to the brother, he laughed heartily, till Alice communicated the secret which constituted her credentials, upon which he changed his tone, and declared himself ready to make the required restitution. Dr. Bretton seems to have made no secret of this story, but to have related it to various persons, and I think it is somewhat in its favour that it exhibits a remarkable instance of the various degrees of receptivity of different individuals, where there was no suspicion of the cause, nor any attempt made to explain why Mrs. Bretton could not communicate her wishes to her husband as easily as to Alice. The promising that the child should sleep was promising no more than many a magnetizer could fulfill. There are several curious stories extant of lame and suffering persons suddenly recovering, who attributed their restoration to the visit of an apparition which had stroked their limbs, etc. And these are the more curious from the fact that they occurred before Mesmer's time, when people in general knew nothing of vital magnetism. Dr. Beans quotes the case of a person named Jacob Olofsson, a resident in some small island subject to Denmark, who after lying very ill for a fortnight was found quite well, which he accounted for by saying that a person in shining clothes had come to him in the night, and stroked him with his hand, whereupon he was presently healed. But the stroking is not always necessary, since we know that the eye and the will can produce the same effect. The other case to which I alluded, as similar to that of Mrs. Bretton, occurred in Germany, and is related by Dr. Kerner. The late Mr. L. St., he says, quitted this world with an excellent reputation, being at the time superintendent of an institution for the relief of the poor in B. His son inherited his property, and in acknowledgment of the faithful services of his father's old housekeeper, he took her into his family, and established her in a country house, a few miles from B., which formed part of his inheritance. She had been settled there but a short time, when she was awakened in the night, she knew not how, and saw a tall, haggard-looking man in her room, who was rendered visible to her by a light that seemed to issue from himself. She drew the bedclothes over her head, but as this apparition appeared to her repeatedly, she became so much alarmed that she mentioned it to her master, begging permission to resign her situation. He, however, laughed at her, told her it must be all imagination, and promised to sleep in the adjoining apartment, in order that she might call him whenever this terror seized her. He did so, but when the spectre returned, she was so much oppressed with horror that she found it impossible to raise her voice. Her master then advised her to inquire the motive of its visits. This she did, whereupon it beckoned her to follow, which, after some struggles, she summoned resolution to do. It then led the way down some steps to a passage, where it pointed out to her a concealed closet, which it signified to her by signs she should open. She represented that she had no key, whereupon it described to her in sufficiently articulate words where she would find one. She procured the key, and on opening the closet found a small parcel, which the spirit desired her to remit to the governor of the institution for the poor at B, with the injunction that the contents should be applied to the benefit of the inmates, this restitution being the only means whereby he could obtain rest and peace in the other world. Having mentioned these circumstances to her master, who bade her do what she had been desired, she took the parcel to the governor, and delivered it, without communicating by what means it had come into her hands. Her name was entered in their books, and she was dismissed, but after she was gone, they discovered to their surprise that the packet contained an order for 30,000 florins, of which the late Mr. St. had defrauded the institution and converted to his own use. Mr. St. Jr. was now called upon to pay the money, which he refusing to do, the affair was at length referred to the authorities, and the housekeeper being arrested, he and she were confronted in the court, where she detailed the circumstances by which the parcel had come into her possession. Mr. St. denied the possibility of the thing, declaring the whole must be, for some purpose or other, an invention of her own. Suddenly, while making this defence, he felt a blow upon his shoulder, which caused him to start and look around, and at the same moment the housekeeper exclaimed, "See, there he stands! Now, there is the ghost!" None perceived the figure excepting the woman herself and Mr. St., but everybody present heard the following words: "My son, repair the injustice I have committed, that I may be at peace." The money was paid, and Mr. St. was so much affected by this painful event that he was seized with a severe illness, from which he with difficulty recovered. Dr. Kerner says that these circumstances occurred in the year 1816, and created a considerable sensation at the time, though at the earnest request of the family of Mr. St. there was an attempt made to hush them up, adding that in the month of October, 1819, he was himself assured by a very respectable citizen of B. that it was universally known in the town that the ghost of the late superintendent had appeared to the housekeeper, and pointed out to her where she would find the packet; that she had consulted the minister of her parish, who bade her deliver it as directed; that she had been subsequently arrested, and the affair brought before the authorities, where while making his defence Mr. St. had received a blow from an invisible hand, and that Mr. St. was so much affected by these circumstances, which got abroad, in spite of the efforts to suppress them, that he did not long survive the event. Groves the antiquary makes himself very merry with the observation that ghosts do not go about their business like other people, and that in cases of murder, instead of going to the nearest justice of peace, or to the nearest relation of the deceased, a ghost addresses itself to somebody who had nothing to do with the matter, or hovers about the grave where its body is deposited. The same circuitous mode is pursued, he says, with respect to redressing injured orphans or widows, where it seems as if the shortest and most certain way would be to go and hunt the person guilty of the injustice till he were terrified into restitution. We find the same sort of strictures made on the story of the ghost of Sir George Villiers, which instead of going directly to his son, the Duke of Buckingham, to warn him of his danger, addressed himself to an inferior person, while the warning was, after all, inefficacious, as the Duke would not take counsel. But surely such strictures are as absurd as the conduct of the ghost. At least, I think, there can be nothing more absurd than pretending to prescribe laws to nature, and judging of what we know so little about. The proceedings of the ghost in the following case will doubtless be equally displeasing to the critics. The account is extracted verbatim from a work published by the Bannatyne Club, and is entitled Authentic Account of the Appearance of a Ghost in Queen Anne's County, Maryland, United States of North America, proved in the following remarkable trial from attested notes taken in court at the time by one of the counsel. It appears that Thomas Harris had made some alteration in the disposal of his property immediately previous to his death, and that the family disputed the will and raised up difficulties likely to be injurious to his children. William Briggs said that he was 43 years of age, that Thomas Harris died in September in the year 1790. In the March following he was riding near the place where Thomas Harris was buried, on a horse formerly belonging to Thomas Harris. After crossing a small branch, his horse began to walk on very fast. It was between the hours of 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning. He was alone. It was a clear day. He entered a lane adjoining to the field where Thomas Harris was buried. His horse suddenly wheeled in a panel of the fence, looked over the fence into the field where Thomas Harris was buried, and neighed very loud. Witness then saw Thomas Harris coming toward him in the same apparel he had last seen him in his lifetime. He had on a sky blue coat. Just before he came to the fence, he varied to the right and vanished. His horse immediately took the road. Thomas Harris came within 2 panels of the fence to him. He did not see his features, nor speak to him. He was acquainted with Thomas Harris when a boy, and there had always been a great intimacy between them. He thinks the horse knew Thomas Harris because of his neighing, pricking up his ears, and looking over the fence. About the 1st of June following, he was ploughing in his own field, about 3 miles from where Thomas Harris was buried. About dusk, Thomas Harris came alongside of him and walked with him about 200 yards. He was dressed as when first seen. He made a halt about 2 steps from him. J. Bailey, who was ploughing along with him, came driving up, and he lost sight of the ghost. He was much alarmed. Not a word was spoken. The young man Bailey did not see him. He did not tell Bailey of it. There was no motion of any particular part. He vanished. It preyed upon his mind so as to affect his health. He was with Thomas Harris when he died, but had no particular conversation with him. Some time after he was lying in bed, about 11 and 12 o'clock at night, when he heard Thomas Harris groan. It was like the groan he gave a few minutes before he expired. Mrs. Briggs, his wife, heard the groan. She got up and searched the house. He did not, because he knew the groan to be from Thomas Harris. Some time after, when in bed, and a great firelight in the room, he saw a shadow on the wall, and at the same time he felt a great weight upon him. Some time after, when in bed and asleep, he felt a stroke between his eyes, which blackened them both. His wife was in bed with him, and two young men were in the room. The blow awaked him, and all in the room were asleep. It's certain no one in the room struck him. The blow swelled his nose. About the middle of August he was alone, coming from Hickey Collins after dark, about 1 hour in the night, when Thomas Harris appeared, dressed as he had seen him when going down to the Meeting House branch, 3 miles and a half from the graveyard of Thomas Harris. It was starlight. He extended his arms over his shoulders. Does not know how long he remained in this situation. He was much alarmed. Thomas Harris disappeared. Nothing was said. He felt no weight on his shoulders. He went back to Collins and got a young man to go with him. After he got home he mentioned it to the young man. He had before this told James Harris he had seen his brother's ghost. In October, about twilight in the morning, he saw Thomas Harris about 100 yards from the house of the witness. His head was leaned to one side. Same apparel as before, his face was toward him. He walked fast and disappeared. There was nothing between them to obstruct the view. He was about 50 yards from him and alone. He had no conception why Thomas Harris appeared to him. On the same day, about 8 o'clock in the morning, he was handing up blades to John Bailey, who was stacking them. He saw Thomas Harris come along the garden fence, dressed as before. He vanished, and always to the east, was within 15 feet of him. Bailey did not see him. An hour and a half afterward, in the same place, he again appeared, coming as before, came up to the fence, leaned on it within 10 feet of the witness, who called to Bailey to look there, pointing toward Thomas Harris. Bailey asked, "What was there?" "Don't you see Harris?" Does not recollect what Bailey said. Witness advanced toward Harris. One or the other spoke as witness got over the fence on the same panel that Thomas Harris was leaning on. They walked off together about 500 yards. A conversation took place as they walked. He has not the conversation on his memory. He could not understand Thomas Harris. His voice was so low. He asked Thomas Harris a question, and he forbid him. Witness then asked, "Why not go to your brother instead of me?" Thomas Harris said, "Ask me no questions." Witness told him his will was doubted. Thomas Harris told him to ask his brother if he did not remember the conversation which passed between them on the east side of the wheat stacks, the day he was taken with his death sickness. That he then declared that he wished all his property kept together by James Harris until his children arrived at age. Then the whole should be sold and divided among his children. And should it be immediately sold, as expressed in his will, that the property would be most wanting to his children, while minors. Therefore he had changed his will, and said that witness should see him again. He then told witness to turn, and disappeared. He did not speak to him with the same voice as in his lifetime. He was not daunted while with Thomas Harris, but much afterward. Witness then went to James Harris and told him that he had seen his brother 3 times that day, related the conversation he had with him, asked James Harris if he remembered the conversation between him and his brother at the wheat stack. He said he did, then told him what had passed. Said he would fulfill his brother's will. He was satisfied that witness had seen his brother, for that no other person knew the conversation. On the same evening, returning home about an hour before sunset, Thomas Harris appeared to him, and came alongside of him. Witness told him that his brother said he would fulfill his will. No more conversation on this subject. He disappeared. He had further conversation with Thomas Harris, but not on this subject. He was always dressed in the same manner. He had never related to any person the last conversation, and never would. Bailey, who was sworn in the cause, declared that as he and Briggs were stacking blades, as related by Briggs, he called to witness and said, "Look there! Do you not see Thomas Harris?" Witness said, "No." Briggs got over the fence, and walked some distance, appeared by his action to be in deep conversation with some person. Witness saw no one. The counsel was extremely anxious to hear from Mr. Briggs the whole of the conversation of the ghost, and on his cross-examination took every means, without effect, to obtain it. They represented to him as a religious man he was bound to disclose the whole truth. He appeared agitated when applied to, declaring nothing short of life should make him reveal the whole conversation, and claiming the protection of the court, that he had declared all he knew relative to the case. The court overruled the question of the counsel, Hon. James Tilghman, Judge. His Excellency Robert Wright,
late Governor of Maryland,
and the Honorable Joseph H. Nicholson, afterward judge of one of the courts in Maryland, were the counsel for the plaintiff. John Scott and Richard T. Earl, Squires, were counsel for the defendant. Here, as in the case of Colonel M. mentioned in a former chapter, and some others I have met with, we find disclosures made that were held sacred. Dr. Kerner relates the following singular story, which he declares himself to have received from the most satisfactory authority. Agnes B., being at the time 18 years of age, was living as servant in a small inn at Undenheim, her native place. The host and hostess were quiet old people, who generally went to bed about 8 o'clock, while she and the boy, the only other servant, were expected to sit up till 10, when they had to shut up the house and retire to bed also. One evening, as the host was sitting on a bench before the door, there came a beggar, requesting a night's lodging. The host, however, refused, and bade him seek what he wanted in the village, whereon the man went away. At the usual hour the old people went to bed, and the two servants, having closed the shutters, and indulged in a little gossip with the watchman, were about to follow their example, when the beggar came round the corner of the neighbouring street, and earnestly entreated them to give him a lodging for the night, since he could find nobody that would take him in. At first the young people refused, saying they dare not, without their master's leave. But at length the entreaties of the men prevailed, and they consented to let him sleep in the barn, on condition that when they called him in the morning he would immediately depart. At 3 o'clock they rose, and when the boy entered the barn, to his dismay he found that the old man had expired in the night. They were now much perplexed with the apprehension of their master's displeasure. So, after some consultation, they agreed that the lad should convey the body out of the barn, and lay it in a dry ditch that was near at hand, where it would be found by the labourers, and excite no question, as they would naturally conclude he had let himself down there to die. This was done, the man was discovered and buried, and they thought themselves well rid of the whole affair. But on the following night the girl was awakened by the beggar, whom she saw standing at her bedside. He looked at her, and then quitted the room by the door. "Glad was I," she says, "when the day broke, but I was scarcely out of my room when the boy came to me, trembling and pale, and before I could say a word to him of what I had seen, he told me that the beggar had been to his room in the night, had looked at him, and then gone away. He said he was dressed as when we had seen him alive, only he looked blacker, which I also had observed. Still afraid of incurring blame, they told nobody, although the apparition returned to them every night, and although they found removing to the other bed chambers did not relieve them from his visits. But the effects of this persecution became so visible on both, that much curiosity was awakened in the village with respect to the cause of the alteration observed in them, and at length the boy's mother went to the minister, and requesting him to interrogate her son, and endeavour to discover what was preying on his mind, to him the boy disclosed their secret, and this minister, who was a Protestant, having listened with attention to the story, advised him, when next he went to Mayence to market, to call on Father Joseph of the Franciscan convent, and relate the circumstance to him. This advice was followed, and Father Joseph, assuring the lad that the ghost could do him no harm, recommended him to ask him in the name of God what he desired. The boy did so, whereupon the apparition answered, "Ye are children of mercy, but I am a child of evil. In the barn, under the straw, you will find my money. Take it, it is yours." In the morning the boy found the money accordingly in an old stocking hid under the straw, but having a natural horror of it, they took it to their minister, who advised them to divide it into 3 parts, giving one to the Franciscan convent at Mayence, another to the Reformed church in the village, and the other third to that to which they themselves belonged, which was of the Lutheran persuasion. This they did, and were no more troubled with the beggar. With respect to the minister who gave them this good advice, I can only say all honour be to him. I wish there were many more such. The circumstance occurred in the year 1750, and is related by the daughter of Agnes B., who declared that she had frequently heard it from her mother. The circumstance of this apparition looking darker than the man had done when alive is significant of his condition, and confirms what I have said above, namely, that the moral state of the disembodied soul can no longer be concealed as it was in the flesh, but that as he is, he must necessarily appear. There is an old saying that we should never lie down to rest at enmity with any human being, and the story of the ghost of the Princess Anna of Saxony, who appeared to Duke Christian of Saxe-Eisenberg, is strongly confirmatory of the wisdom of this axiom. Duke Christian was sitting one morning in his study, when he was surprised by a knock at his door, an unusual circumstance, since the guards, as well as the people in waiting, were always in the ante-room. He, however, cried, "Come in," when there entered, to his amazement, a lady in an ancient costume, who, in answer to his inquiries, told him that she was no evil spirit, and would do him no harm, but that she was one of his ancestors, and had been the wife of Duke John Casimir of Saxe-Coburg. She then related that she and her husband had not been on good terms at the period of their death, and that although she had sought a reconciliation, he had been inexorable, pursuing her with unmitigated hatred, and injuring her by unjust suspicions, and that consequently, although she was happy, he was still wandering in cold and darkness, between time and eternity. She had, however, long known that one of their descendants was destined to effect this reconciliation for them, and they were rejoiced to find the time for it had at length arrived. She then gave the Duke 8 days to consider if he were willing to perform this good office, and disappeared, whereupon he consulted a clergyman in whom he had great confidence, who, after finding the ghost's communication verified by a reference to the annals of the family, advised him to comply with her request. As the Duke had yet some difficulty in believing it was really a ghost he had seen, he took care to have his door well watched. She, however, entered at the appointed time, unseen by the attendants, and having received the Duke's promise, she told him she would return with her husband on the following night, for that, though she could come by day, he could not; that then, having heard the circumstances, the Duke must arbitrate between them, and then unite their hands, and bless them. The door was still watched, but nevertheless the apparitions both came, the Duke Casimir in full royal costume, but of a livid paleness, and when the wife had told her story, he told his. Duke Christian decided for the lady, in which judgment Duke Casimir fully acquiesced. Christian then took the ice-cold hand of Casimir and laid it in that of his wife, which felt of a natural heat. They then prayed and sang together, and the apparitions disappeared, having foretold that Duke Christian would ere long be with them. The family records showed that these people had lived about 100 years before Duke Christian's time, who himself died in 1707, 2 years after these visits of his ancestors. He desired to be buried in quicklime. It is supposed from an idea that it might prevent his ghost walking the earth. The costume in which they appeared was precisely that they had worn when alive, as was ascertained by a reference to their portraits. The expression that her husband was wandering in cold and darkness between time and eternity is here very worthy of observation, as are the circumstances that his hand was cold, while hers was warm, and also the greater privilege she seemed to enjoy. The hands of the unhappy spirits appear, I think, invariably to communicate a sensation of cold. I have heard of 3 instances of persons now alive, who declare that they hold continual intercourse with their deceased partners. One of these is a naval officer, whom the author of a book lately published, called The Unseen World, appears to be acquainted with. The second is a professor in a college in America, a man of eminence and learning, and full of activity and energy. Yet he assured a friend of mine that he receives constant visits from his departed wife, which afford him great satisfaction. The third example is a lady in this country. She is united to a second husband, has been extremely happy in both marriages, and declares that she receives frequent visits from her first. Oberlin, the good pastor of Ban de la Roche, asserted the same thing of himself. His wife came to him frequently after her death, was seen by the rest of his household as well as himself, and warned him beforehand of many events that occurred. Mrs. Matthews relates in the memoirs of her husband that he was one night in bed and unable to sleep, from the excitement that continues some time after acting, when hearing a rustling by the side of the bed, he looked out and saw his first wife, who was then dead, standing by the bedside, dressed as when alive. She smiled and bent forward as if to take his hand, but in his alarm he threw himself out on the floor to avoid the contact, and was found by the landlord in a fit. The same night and the same hour the present Mrs. Matthews, who was far away from him, received a similar visit from her predecessor, whom she had known when alive. She was quite awake, and in her terror seized the bell rope to summon assistance, which gave way, and she fell with it in her hand to the ground. Professor Barth, who visited Oberlin in 1824, says that while he spoke of his intercourse with the spiritual world as familiarly as of the daily visits of his parishioners, he was, at the same time, perfectly free from fanaticism, and eagerly alive to all the concerns of this earthly existence. He asserted, what I find many somnambulous and diseased persons also assert, that everything on earth is but a copy, of which the antitype is to be found in the other. He said to his visitor that he might as well attempt to persuade him that there was not a table before them, as that he did not hold communication with the other world. I give you credit for being honest when you assure me that you never saw anything of the kind, said he. Give me the same credit when I assure you that I do. With respect to the faculty of ghost seeing, he said, it depends on several circumstances, external and internal. People who live in the bustle and glare of the world seldom see them, while those who live in still, solitary, thinly inhabited places, like the mountainous districts of various countries, do. So if I go into the forest by night, I see the phosphoric light of a piece of rotten wood, but if I go by day, I cannot see it, yet it is still there. Again there must be a report. A tender mother is awakened by the faintest cry of her infant, while the maid slumbers on, and never hears it. And if I thrust a needle among a parcel of wood shavings, and hold a magnet over them, the needle is stirred while the shavings are quite unmoved. There must be a particular aptitude. What it consists in I do not know. Four of my people, many of whom are ghost seers, some are weak and sickly, others vigorous and strong. Here are several pieces of flint. I can see no difference in them, yet some have so much iron in them that they easily become magnetic. Others have little or none. So it is with the faculty of ghost seeing. People may laugh as they will, but the thing is a fact, nevertheless. The visits of his wife continued for 9 years after her death, and then ceased. At length she sent him a message through another deceased person, to say that she was now elevated to a higher state, and could therefore no longer revisit the earth. Never was there a purer spirit, nor a more beloved human being than Oberlin. When first he was appointed to the cure of Ban de la Roche, and found his people talking so familiarly of the reappearance of the dead, he reproved them and preached against the superstition, nor was he convinced till after the death of his wife. She had, however, previously received a visit from her deceased sister, the wife of Professor Oberlin of Strasbourg, who had warned her of her approaching death, for which she immediately set about preparing, making extra clothing for her children, and even laying in provision for the funeral feast. She then took leave of her husband and family, and went quietly to bed. On the following morning she died, and Oberlin never heard of the warning she had received, till she disclosed it to him in her spectral visitations. In narrating the following story, I am not permitted to give the names of the place or parties, nor the number of the regiment, with all of which, however, I am acquainted. The account was taken down by one of the officers with whose family I am also acquainted, and the circumstance occurred within the last 10 years. About the month of August, says Captain E., my attention was requested by the schoolmaster sergeant, a man of considerable worth, and highly esteemed by the whole corps, to an event which had occurred in the garrison hospital. Having heard his recital, which from the serious earnestness with which he made it, challenged attention, I resolved to investigate the matter, and having communicated the circumstances to a friend, we both repaired to the hospital for the purpose of enquire. There were 2 patients to be examined, both men of good character, and neither of them suffering from any disorder affecting the brain. The one was under treatment for consumptive symptoms, and the other for an ulcerated leg. They were both in the prime of life. Having received a confirmation of the schoolmaster's statement from the hospital surgeon, also a very respectable and trustworthy man, I sent for the patient principally concerned, and desired him to state what he had seen and heard, warning him at the same time that it was my intention to take down his deposition, and that it behooved him to be very careful, as possibly serious steps might be taken for the purpose of discovering whether an imposition had been practised in the wards of the hospital, a crime for which he was well aware a very severe penalty would be inflicted. He then proceeded to relate the circumstances which I took down in the presence of Mr. B. and the hospital surgeon, as follows. It was last Tuesday night, somewhere between 11 and 12, and all of us were in bed, and all lights out except the rushlight that was allowed for the man with the fever, when I was woke by feeling a weight upon my feet, and at the same moment, as I was drawing up my legs, Private W., who lies in the cot opposite mine, called out, "I say, Q, there is somebody sitting upon your legs." And as I looked to the bottom of my bed, I saw some one get up from it, and then come round and stand over me, in the passage between my cot and the next. I felt somewhat alarmed, for the last few nights the ward had been disturbed by sounds as of a heavy foot walking up and down, and as nobody could be seen, it was beginning to be supposed among us that it was haunted, and fancying this that came up to my bed's head might be the ghost, I called out, "Who are you?" And what do you want?" The figure then, leaning with one hand on the wall over my head and stooping down, said in my ear, "I am Mrs. M." And I could then distinguish that she was dressed in a flannel gown, edged with black riband, exactly similar to a set of grave clothes in which I had assisted to clothe her corpse, when her death took place a year previously. The voice, however, was not like Mrs. M.'s, nor like anybody else's, yet it was very distinct, and seemed somehow to sing through my head. I could see nothing of a face beyond a darkish color about the head, and it appeared to me that I could see through her body against the window glasses. Although I felt very uncomfortable, I asked her what she wanted. She replied, "I am Mrs. M., and I wish you to write to him that was my husband, and tell him." "I am not, sir," said Corporal Q., "at liberty to mention to anybody what she told me, except to her husband. He is at the depot in Ireland, and I have written and told him. She made me promise not to tell anyone else. After I had promised secrecy, she told me something of a matter that convinced me I was talking to a spirit, for it related to what only I and Mrs. M. knew, and no one living could know anything whatever of the matter. And if I was now speaking my last words on earth, I say solemnly that it was Mrs. M.'s spirit that spoke to me then, and no one else. After promising that if I complied with her request she would not trouble me or the ward again, she went from my bed toward the fireplace, and with her hands she kept feeling about the wall over the mantelpiece. After a while she came toward me again, and while my eyes were upon her she somehow disappeared from my sight altogether, and I was left alone. It was then that I felt faint-like, and a cold sweat broke out over me, but I did not faint, and after a time I got better, and gradually I went off to sleep. The man at the ward said next day that Mrs. M. had come to speak to me about purgatory, because she had been a Roman Catholic, and we had often had arguments on religion, but what she told me had no reference to such subjects, but to a matter only she and I knew of. After closely cross-questioning Corporal Q., and endeavoring without success to reason him out of his belief in the ghostly character of his visitor, I read over to him what I had written, and then dismissing him, sent for the other patient. After cautioning him as I had done the first, I proceeded to take down his statement, which was made with every appearance of good faith and sincerity. "I was lying awake," said he, "last Tuesday night, when I saw some one sitting on Corporal Q.'s bed. There was so little light in the ward that I could not make out who it was, and the figure looked so strange that I got alarmed, and felt quite sick. I called out to Corporal Q. that there was somebody sitting upon his bed, and then the figure got up, and as I did not know but it might be coming to me, I got so much alarmed that being but weakly, this was the consumptive man, I fell back, and I believe I fainted away. When I got round again, I saw the figure standing and apparently talking to the corporal, placing one hand against the wall, and stooping down. I could not, however, hear any voice, and being still much alarmed, I put my head under the clothes for a considerable time. When I looked up again, I could only see Corporal Q. sitting up in bed alone, and he said he had seen a ghost, and I told him I had also seen it. After a time he got up and gave me a drink of water, for I was very faint. Some of the other patients being disturbed by our talking, they bade us be quiet, and after some time I got to sleep. The ward has not been disturbed since. The man was then cross-questioned, but his testimony remaining quite unshaken, he was dismissed, and the hospital surgeon was interrogated with regard to the possibility of a trick having been practised. He asserted, however, that this was impossible, and certainly from my own knowledge of the hospital regulations and the habits of the patients, I should say that a practical joke of this nature was too serious a thing to have been attempted by anybody, especially as there were patients in the ward very ill at the time, and one very near his end. The punishment would have been extremely severe, and discovery almost certain, since everybody would have been adverse to the delinquent. The investigation that ensued was a very brief one, it being found that there was nothing more to be elicited, and the affair terminated with the supposition that the two men had been dreaming. Nevertheless, 6 months afterward, on being interrogated, their evidence and their conviction were as clear as at first, and they declared themselves ready at any time to repeat their statement upon oath. Supposing this case to be as the men believed it, there are several things worthy of observation. In the first place, the ghost is guilty of that inconsistency so offensive to Francis Grose and many others. Instead of telling her secret to her husband, she commissions the corporal to tell it him, and it is not till a year after her departure from this life that she does even that, and she is heard in the ward 2 or 3 nights before she is visible. We are therefore constrained to suppose that, like Mrs. Bretton, she could not communicate with her husband, and that till that Tuesday night the necessary conditions for attaining her object as regarded the corporal were wanting. It is also remarkable that although the latter heard her speak distinctly, and spoke to her, the other man heard no voice, which renders it probable that she had at length been able to produce that impression upon him, which a magnetizer does on his somnambule, enable each to understand the other by a transference of thought, which was undistinguishable to the corporal from speech, as it is frequently to the somnambule. The imitating the actions of life by leaning against the wall and feeling about the mantelpiece are very unlike what a person would have done who was endeavoring to impose on the man, and equally unlike what they would have reported, had the thing been an invention of their own. Among the established jests on the subject of ghosts, their sudden vanishing is a very fruitful one, but I think if we examine this question, we shall find that there is nothing comical in the matter except the ignorance or want of reflection of the jesters. In the first place, as I have before observed, a spirit must be where its thoughts and affections are, for they are itself. Our spirits are where our thoughts and affections are, although our solid bodies remain stationary, and no one will suppose that walls or doors or material obstacles of any kind could exclude a spirit any more than they can exclude our thoughts. But then there is the visible body of the spirit. What is that? And how does it retain its shape? For we know that there is a law, discovered by Dalton, that two masses of gaseous matter cannot remain in contact, but they will immediately proceed to diffuse themselves into one another. And accordingly it may be advanced that a gaseous corporeity in the atmosphere is an impossibility, because it could not retain its form, but would inevitably be dissolved away and blend with the surrounding air. But precisely the same objection might be made by a chemist to the possibility of our fleshly bodies retaining their integrity and compactness, for the human body taken as a whole is known to be an impossible chemical compound, except for the vitality which upholds it, and no sooner is life withdrawn from it than it crumbles into putrescence, and it is undeniable that the aeriform body would be an impossible mechanical phenomenon but for the vitality which we are entitled to suppose may uphold it. But just as the state or condition of organization protects the fleshly body from the natural reactions which would destroy it, so may an analogous condition of organization protect a spiritual ethereal body from the destructive influence of the mutual interdiffusion of gases. Thus, supposing this aeriform body to be a permanent appurtenance of the spirit, we see how it may subsist and retain its integrity, and it would be as reasonable to hope to exclude the electric fluid by walls or doors as to exclude by them this subtle fluent form. If, on the contrary, the shape be only one constructed out of the atmosphere by an act of will, the same act of will, which is a vital force, preserve it entire until the will being withdrawn, it dissolves away. In either case, the moment the will or thought of the spirit is elsewhere, it is gone, it has vanished. For those who prefer the other hypothesis, namely, that there is no outstanding shape at all, but that the will of the spirit, acting on the constructive imagination of the seer, enables him to conceive the form, as the spirit itself conceives of it, there can be no difficulty in understanding that the becoming invisible will depend merely on a similar act of will. End of chapter 12. Troubled Spirits.